Ladies and gentlemen, thank you and welcome again. We just wrapped up open source defense. Great presentation there. And now for the last best presentation of the evening. Sorry, Daniel and Kareem. I'm proud to introduce my friend Grant Cunningham. Grant has been a longtime friend of the club. If you've not downloaded the book that he wrote for us in the membership portal, get thee to the membership portal and download it. Guide to Buying Firearms for People Who Don't Buy Firearms. It's not actually the title, but I can't be bothered to go look up what the actual title is. And tonight, Grant's going to talk a little bit about, I believe, how the Second Amendment really is for everyone. Without further ado, Grant, I'm going to shut up and turn my video off.
Okay, well, thank you for having me. This is quite an honor. Before we get started, I want to show. Some people probably asking, Grant, what happened to your hair? I want to show you that I have pandemic hair. So I'm just going to turn around and you see my pandemic hair there. And this is an odd thing to have happen, of course, when you're expecting to have a national meeting like this, and this is a great way to do it, a great alternative. So thank you for allowing me to participate. I will say, though, I kind of miss the personal interaction that happens at these kind of meetings. Last year at Morro Bay, for instance, a great time, met a lot of really wonderful people there, and had a lot of great conversation. Of course, you talk about guns, which we always do, but we also had discussions about music and German expressionism. And I think I can say without fear of contradiction that you don't hear very many German expressionism discussions at the NRA annual meeting. Yeehaw. So it's always a pleasure. Had a lot of fun there. I'm going to talk a little bit tonight about the book and about its gestation. And its gestation, interestingly enough, is sort of intertwined with my life and my experience and things that have happened. And so I'm going to take you on a little journey and talk about that. Because it's all part and parcel about why I wrote that book and who I wrote that book for. So to start with, I was born a small child, which annoyed my mother because she was expecting an infant, but I was born in a small farming and logging community here in Oregon. We lived on a farm, grew up in an old farmhouse, and of course we had firearms. In fact, we had 3 firearms that I knew of. Later, in high school, I discovered that there were 4. The 4th one I didn't know about until Dad showed it to me. But I grew up with, we had a shotgun, of course, for those times when Dad might want to go duck hunting, or when the pheasants out in our fields were getting particularly active and we'd go out and maybe have a pheasant dinner occasionally. Of course, we had a 30-30 hunting rifle, and that's what Dad used when he went out on those occasions to go deer hunting. And we had a 22 bolt action rifle, which is sort of the quintessential farm weapon. That's the gun that gets used more than any other. It gets used for all kinds of things. And so this is what I grew up with. It was normal, but it was different because back in the 60s, and particularly on a farm, these things were tools, kind of like a hoe or a shovel or a hammer. I was pretty good with them. I was pretty good at using them, just as I was pretty good at using a hoe and a shovel and a hammer. Well, except for this one little problem, and the fact is I'm fundamentally lazy. And keep in mind, we're talking implements that represent work. And so I wasn't particularly keen on firearms other than doing what I needed with them and getting it done with. I was pretty good with them. In fact, you kind of have to be. If you're going to use a tool, you want to be good with it. So I was fairly good with it. But as soon as the job was done, my interest in the guns just sort of evaporated. I didn't want to work any harder than I had to. So growing up with this, and keep in mind that my family was, my father's family was up in Washington. We didn't see much of them. My mother's family was here in Oregon. We saw them quite a bit. And this was a very conservative family. I have 34 first cousins on my mother's side alone, and they're all generally very conservative people. My mom and dad were not quite as conservative. In fact, I think my dad probably would have been considered a raging radical in some ways, but by and large, everybody pretty just much assumed that everybody in the family had approximately the same outlook on life. Now, it's been said that if you're not a liberal when you're young, you have no heart. And if you're not a conservative when you're older, you have no head. Well, apparently, I didn't hear that because I started off as a conservative when I was very young. As a matter of fact, I maintained my conservatism through high school. I got more and more conservative, and through college, where I would engage in raging debates with my professors, who were invariably far more liberal than I was. I was so conservative, in fact, that when it came time to vote in my first presidential election, which was 1980, that was the first one I was able to vote in. I voted for Ronald Reagan. Yes, I voted for Ronald Reagan, and I turned around and did it again 4 years later. I'm not particularly happy with that now, but in my own defense, it seemed like a good idea at the time. It's only later that you learn that maybe these good ideas aren't so good after all. And that's pretty much what happened to me. Now, when I was in college, I minored in music. And so I hung around a lot of musicians, and, musicians attract artists and writers and intellectuals in general. And for some reason, they let me hang around. I don't know if they were amused by my relative lack of sophistication or simply hope that maybe I could be rehabilitated, but they let me hang around. And I developed a slightly different outlook on life than I had growing up. Took a few years, of course. And then after college, as I got out in the workforce and started hanging around with a lot more people like this, my views started to change. I discovered that there were other people in the world, people with different views than I had, sometimes radically different views, but they were all well considered. They were all valid for them. And so I was sort of forced into acknowledging that there were other ways at looking at the world. Well, this kind of left me with a foot in both camps. I grew up in a conservative family, being very conservative, and here in my life, I'm becoming more liberal and hanging around with more liberal people. And of course, in the firearms industry, where I eventually ended up after stints in a couple other industries, it's simply assumed that you are a raging conservative like everyone else. In fact, sometimes it's even assumed that you have the same religious outlook as well as the same political outlook. And quite frankly, I was pretty good at playing both ends to the middle, and so I got along with everybody. And that's the one thing you learn on a farm in a small town. By the way, our small town was, I remember when it got to 1,500 people, that gives you an idea of how small it was. Everybody pretty much relies on everybody else. And so you have to get along with people. And so I learned to get along with people who were very conservative and people who were very liberal. And that's what I did. That's how I get along in this relatively strange world of the firearms industry. So that's where I come from and my outlook on life. Now, what led to the writing of the book goes back to an incident that happened in this very conservative family. Now, as I said, I have more than 30 first cousins on my mother's side alone, and all of them were married except one. And about 15 years ago, she decided to get married. Now, she was in the midst of a great career in the U.S. Army. She eventually became a 2-star general, believe it or not. And so she didn't seem to have a lot of time for romance. And we just always assumed that she'd probably never get married. And then one day she turns up with a boyfriend and says, "We are engaged." Now, keep in mind, she again comes from this very conservative family. Her father, my uncle, was perhaps the most conservative of all of us. And when she brought her fiance home to meet the family. It turns out that he came from just a little bit different background. He came from a very old, very liberal East Coast family. And we're talking very urban, very sheltered, gated community, that kind of thing, old money. And he was very liberal. How liberal, you ask? Well, at the time, he was working as a speechwriter for Harry Reid, who was the top-ranking Democrat, I think, in the Senate. I'd have to go back and check, but that's who he was working for. And he later, as it became a consultant for the Democratic National Party and all that kind of thing. So, as you can imagine, in my family, that was a bit of a shock. And then we found out that he had never touched a gun before, never really been next to a gun. Guns were not something that he grew up with. And so there were a few tense times when our family was out using the shooting range on his fiance's family's ranch. And it was a very long time before he would even be in the same vicinity as a firearm, let alone actually touching one. So they got married. Now they decided to get married and have the reception at her family's ranch here in Oregon. And as it happens, there's a little church, which is about a mile down the road from the driveway that goes into their ranch. And so they decided to have this wedding at the church, and they were going to walk back to the ranch for the reception. It was a nice spring day, beautiful, not a cloud. They had a wonderful walk back. And greeting them at the entrance to the driveway to the ranch was a group of her cousins, including me. And what had happened is one of my cousins managed to get his hands on some white 12-gauge shot shells. He loaded them with a primer, a wad, and a bunch of puffed rice. And when you fired these things, the primer was more than sufficient to drive this puffed rice 20 feet into the air very, very easily. And so he made up a bunch of them, called a bunch of the cousins, including me, including my brother, and we all brought our 12-gauge shotguns, loaded up the tubes with these beautiful white shot shells. I still have one of them around here someplace. And as the bride and groom came into the driveway, we flanked them, declared that we were giving her a shotgun wedding. And as they walked down the driveway to the reception area, every so often we were walking in military fashion with shotguns on our shoulders, and every so often her brother would call out, and we would point the barrel straight in the air, fire one round, and this puff rice just went everywhere. The videographer for this thing was walking backwards and filming this entire thing as she was going. And she was laughing so hard at one point that she went ass over tea kettle in the driveway, and we had to help her up. It was a wonderful thing. It was a lot of fun. There was a lot of puffed rice all over the place on the driveway when we were done. But the funny thing was, as we got down to the area where the reception was being held, and keep in mind, this was a big wedding. My family doesn't do anything small. This was a big wedding. I noticed that his relatives, who had all flown in from the East Coast to attend this wedding, they were diving for cover. Literally, there were a couple of them that were looking maybe they could get under the table. There were a bunch of them holding their ears like this, even though a primer-powered shot shell doesn't make a whole lot of noise, as most of you are probably aware. But they were scared to death. They had never seen a firearm in the hands of someone other than a police officer or perhaps a soldier, let alone in their own vicinity. And they were scared to death of these things. We, of course, were very careful. We were very safe this entire time. And once we had escorted the bride to the reception, we locked all the guns away in our trunks, and the merrymaking began. The guns did not come out again. Of course, we're very safe with all these things. But the trepidation amongst her relatives continued. They were scared of the guns. They were scared of us. I think they were mostly scared of who their relative was marrying, the family that he was marrying into. By the way, it turns out he's an awfully nice guy, very intelligent fellow, and about 50, like I said, this is about 15 years ago. They're still very happily married and have a great marriage. So they turned out to be a good match. I'm sure his relatives didn't think that this was going to work out, but it did. Rumor has it that he even has his own .22 rifle now. I haven't verified that, but this is the rumor in the family. Anyway, so as I'm watching these people, I'm thinking about what they're going through. They're scared of these guns. And I thought, what happens if one of them decides that he or she wants to own a firearm for whatever reason? Keep in mind, when I grew up, as I told you, the idea of a firearm as a recreational or defensive tool was just unknown. It was just another farm implement as far as we concerned. But we were not everyone. There were a lot of people, and especially as I got into the firearms industry, that I found out had other uses for firearms. Of course, self-defense, that kind of thing. And some of them even just like the recreational aspects of it, shooting clays, doing that sort of thing. So it's entirely possible that maybe one of these people would themselves like to own a firearm someday. And I got to thinking, where are these people ever going to find information? I mean, if one of them walked into a gun store, they might faint. You've been into a lot of gun stores in the world, and let's face it, they're not exactly friendly to people who don't fit their demographic. And his relatives very definitely did not. They had very definite ideas about firearms, very definite ideas about firearms owners, and many of those ideas were probably offensive to the people who might sell them a firearm or might work in the store that would sell them a firearm. So I began to, this sort of percolated in my mind for the longest time. And having both, as I said, a foot in both camps, both on the conservative side and the liberal side, I thought that I probably had a pretty good base of knowledge and information and empathy to present something that would show both sides of the of this chasm, this political chasm that has grown up around firearms. And maybe I could, in a small way, help the two to meet in the middle. And so this idea for the book was born. I wrote it from the standpoint of someone who does not come from this very conservative background that I came from, but was in this very liberal sort of environment that I had become accustomed to because of the things that I did and the interests that I had. And after speaking with a number of people that I knew, musicians, writers, in some cases, some religious leaders from religious traditions that are not fundamentalist Christian. And I was able to talk with them. And in some cases, I would broach the subject of firearms. What do you think of firearms? What do you think of the people who own them? Well, as you can imagine, I got an earful more than once. The same kind of earful that I suspect that this fellow's family would have given me had they not been so scared of the shotgun that I had been carrying a few minutes prior. So I asked around and I asked people what they thought. Would they ever be interested in buying a firearm? And if so, how would they go about doing it? And most of them didn't know. Most of them, of course, didn't want to buy a firearm. They weren't interested in buying a firearm, but those who would entertain the idea that maybe, just maybe, they might want to do that someday gave me some valuable information. And so I sat down to write the book. And what I wanted to do was to treat both sides as fairly as I possibly could. I didn't want to cast any more aspersions than I absolutely had to. Excuse me. I'm going to take a drink here because, as I said, it's very warm in here. For those who are coming in a little late, it's probably right now about 90 degrees in my office. So, okay. So I wanted to treat the person, the liberal person who is going to buy a gun, without talking down to them. And I also wanted to explain to them what they were getting into in terms of the socio-political aspects of the gun business. So I started writing the book. And, it's kind of funny when you sit down and think about, I'm sure everybody probably had that assignment in grade school where you had to write a little paper about how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And the idea behind that exercise is to force you to think through what you have to do. All those little things that you really don't think about when you make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And when you first write your paper, you don't think about taking the lid off the jar, for instance, getting the knife out of the silverware drawer, all these little things that you have to talk to people about. And that's kind of where I found myself writing this book. There were a lot of things that I knew that I simply accepted that I knew because it had been part of my life for so long that a lot of other people didn't. And I had to think about how I was going to present that to this new gun owner. Just going into a gun store, and I know a lot of you have already had this experience, but going into a gun store is a frightening thing for a lot of people, unless it's a chain of sporting goods stores where everything is regimented and corporatized and, everybody's wearing the same shirt and all that kind of thing. If they go into a privately and independently owned gun store, they're likely to find a very, very different world than they've ever been in before. And I wanted to help them navigate that, not only so that they could buy a gun, but also so they wouldn't be frightened of that. And so I put it out as simply as I could, that they will probably run into people whose political outlooks were not like theirs and who might even be hostile to their way of life, their beliefs, their political positions. And how do I tell people about this without scaring them off, but still allow them to navigate through that? Even going to the range, I thought quite a bit about going to the range for the first time and what how do you go to the range? What happens at the range? Who are some of the people that you're likely to run into at the range? This all came from my background in the firearms industry. And when I was executive officer of our gun club, I dealt with a lot of people who came to the range to shoot. I don't think any of them were very liberal. They were almost always exactly the opposite, as a matter of fact. And so I had a pretty good feeling for the kind of people that these new gun owners were going to interact with. And it's my firm belief that most people, and this may be naive, I'll grant you that before I say it, but I really believe that most people are decent human beings. I don't think anybody gets up in the morning and says, I want to destroy the United States today. I think most people, when faced with somebody who is different than they are, if they simply take the time to get to know them, that although they may not agree with them, at least they will treat them civilly. That's always been my experience. My own father, for instance, was horribly racist in a lot of ways. And the funny thing, he grew up in a very small town. His father was quite a racist. And the funny thing about my father is that his racism disappeared when he got to meet people. As a matter of fact, it usually disappeared when he had the chance to sit down and have a meal with them. I truly believe that dinners are the great equalizer among peoples because I watched more than one case of my father getting to know somebody of a different nationality than he was, somebody of a different skin color than he was, and coming away with a different attitude. And so I hoped to bring some of that to what I was writing in this book. And I hope that I've succeeded. If you haven't had a chance to read the book, I hope you download it and read through it and see what I've written there. And I'd really like some feedback, if I've succeeded in my goal of being able to bring two sides together, at least to do one little thing, and that is to make a new gun owner, a new safe gun owner, a new gun owner who understands that there may be people in this world who don't agree with them, but at least they can get along with them for long enough to do something of common interest. Now, like I said, I'm not naive. I know that for a lot of people in this world, they're never going to change their attitudes, that there will always be people who look down on other people who treat them differently. I know that's going to happen. And I know that people who interact with the new gun owner may not always present the best example of humanity. Yeah, I get that. But I hope that maybe a few of them will be changed with this encounter, and with more new gun owners who are who classify themselves as liberal. That's going to happen more and more often. Originally, when I wrote this book, I had hoped to present it to a general audience. That was my hope. And after my editor got done with it, my editor's a very, very sharp gal. Edits a lot of gun magazines, edits a lot of gun books, has a degree in social anthropology from Bryn Mawr University. So she, too, has a foot in both sides of this. And when we got done with the editing, she said, listen, she said, I don't think that the people on the conservative side of the aisle are really going to be excited about a book like this. And she said, I think you need to get it to the people on the other side of the aisle, the people who are looking to buy their first gun, who are looking to enter the firearms world. I had kind of hoped that by presenting it to a general audience that I might get some movement from the right side of things. And as we talked, and she convinced me that perhaps this wasn't the right way. Perhaps there was an audience who needed the information more. Perhaps there were people out there who could really use this and use it so that they could join the ranks of firearms owners. And that's when I suggested to Lara and Ed that the Liberal Gun Club take this book and publish it. And that's exactly what happened. And I'm very proud of the fact that the Liberal Gun Club is taking the initiative and publishing this book and getting it out to the people who can use it. I don't know if it'll have any effect on the conservative side of the aisle. I hope it will. But I do know, after hearing from a few people, that has helped the liberal side of the aisle perhaps get along a little better than they might have left to their own devices. And hopefully they've avoided some pain and some embarrassment and some prejudice. So that's how it happened. All through my life, being a conservative, then as I get older, becoming more and more liberal, and recognizing that my friends on the liberal side, and I've made a lot of friends who are very liberal, needed this information from me. And I'd never really shared it with them before. So I hope you've enjoyed it. And I hope it's done the club some good in that regard as well. Ed said that we would open this up to some questions, and I'm actually running a little ahead of schedule. I thought I would be more verbose than I was, but I'm actually running about 10 minutes ahead of schedule. So, Ed, we can open it up to questions if you would like.
Kyle, you got questions for us, or
There are a few questions that I have here for him.
I'm going to get a drink while you read them because I'm about to just melt into my seat here. It's very warm.
With that kind of temperature, don't blame me at all.
By the way, I noticed somebody in the remarks before we started said that Hydro Flask beats Clean Canteen. Yes, they do. By the way, designed in Oregon. By the way, I am a very, very proud Oregonian. I know some of you already know this, but I'm a very proud Oregonian. I'm very proud to have been born here, to have lived here all my life, and I intend to pass away here as well. And I try not to be as insufferable as Texans are, but I'm close.
Now I'm curious as to the differences. Why is that better? Before we even start on the other questions.
What's that?
The flask versus the Clean Canteen.
The Hydro Flask I found has better insulation, and frankly is more durable. And we're talking the insulated Clean Canteen. The regular uninsulated Clean Canteens are just worthless. But the insulated ones, I found the Hydro Flask to last better. And you can take a look. This one has been just, around. And this one, I had it at the. Some of you probably saw this at the meeting last year. I always have it with me, and this thing it just gets beat all to crap, and it still works. I went through 2 or 3 Clean Canteens before I bit the bullet and got one of these. Absolutely great product.
Excellent. Well, I know a couple people and myself were like, what? I don't have either of these. But
I tell you, and I had my doubts. An insulated stainless steel water bottle is an absolutely great thing. I cannot imagine living without it, especially in the summer when it's hot like this, and being able to put iced tea in it and not have it sweat all over the place. And you can leave this thing out in the sun and the drinks still stay cold. You pick it up and it burns your hands, but the drinks are still cold. I love those things. I wouldn't be without one now.
Sorry, Ed. I see the conversation going there. And I guess I'm voted third now. Thank you, guys and gals. Fantastic. First question, though. Do you actually have an audiobook for this? And if you don't, will you record it? Because you're voted, I think, number 2 on having the best voice that we've heard so far. Which I have to admit, I'm a little envious of, since I'm in 3rd place now.
Wow, I'm really surprised. I always thought I had a voice better suited to newspapers than. Well, thank you for the. If there's enough, if people want an audiobook, I'll record an audiobook. Sure.
I do believe Ms. Smith there will be very happy to hear that.
Oh, good. Okay. Yeah, I can do that. I've never done an audiobook, but I'm sure I can.
We have the gear for it.
Audio guy. We have an audio guy, I bet.
Oh. Excuse me.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I just volunteered Paul, who's our audio guy, to get with you, and I'll get us all together, and we'll figure out how to make it happen.
Okay. Yeah, I do know that the hard part doing an audiobook is actually the editing. That's people tell me that's the most time-consuming part of it. So, I'm not much of an audio editor. I did my stint with audio editing was back in the days when we were cutting and splicing tape. Okay. And I've done some audio editing in the modern way, and I am not very fast at it. So if somebody can handle the editing part of it, the rest is easy.
Yeah, Paul does that for a living. He's a professional studio Florida man.
Perfect.
And Mark, every idea that you have, I'm giving to somebody else because you ranked me lower than Grant. I'm sorry. That's just the way it is now. Next question, though. As an experienced gun owner, how do you deal with the local gun store clerk who isn't very nice to the new gun owner? And I like to add on there, the liberal gun owner are also the ones that don't fit the typical demographic?
First of all, I don't spend a lot of time in the local gun stores. And that's intentional because I really don't like guns pointed at me all the time. I've got a real thing about that. I have, however, been in a gun store where someone came in who did not fit the normal demographic profile and was studiously ignored. And I've said to the clerk, "Hey, take this person before me." And my usual line is, I'm not going to spend any money today. I'm a cheapskate, but this person probably wants to. And kind of a subtle nod. I have had situations, and this one this annoys me. It annoys my wife. I know it annoys Larry because I know we've talked about this before. Couple goes in, female part of the couple wants to buy a gun. Her boyfriend / husband gets all the attention. And I've been known to tell the clerk, "Hey, stop talking to him. She's the one who wants to buy it." And explain to them that she's the one who probably controls the purse string. So you really want to be nice to her. And so I've done that in the past as well. I haven't encountered anything really nasty. But like I said, that's probably because I just don't spend a whole lot of time in the gun stores. It helps when you have an FFL to not spend time in the gun stores. But I pointed out things very subtly. I've never seen anything really bad, but I have heard enough stories from other people that I know it's happened. But I've spoken up. Yeah. And if I were in a gun store and I saw someone, of color or, of, the LGBTQ community, I know there are a bunch of letters after that, but I never remember what they are. So people who are in that community will have to forgive me because I just don't remember all the acronyms. But if they were being, actively discriminated against, I would speak up. In fact, I would probably tell them, "Listen, I can tell you a gun store to go to where you won't be treated like shit." And I've been known to say things like that. I don't have a good filter, by the way. Sometimes, sometimes things come out that later I wish I hadn't said, but I would probably say something along that line.
We don't have a wide variety of questions this evening. The last time this happened for the last session, I asked, "What's your favorite firearm of both of the ODS guys?" So I'm going to ask that, or sorry, OSD guys. Got that backwards. So I'm going to ask that, and we'll have some other questions rolling in here shortly. Okay.
So the question is, what's my favorite firearm?
Yes. What's your favorite firearm? Pick anything you like. Whatever scenario, just
oh boy. I would have to say my absolute favorite firearm is a good bolt action 22 rifle. Primarily because, here on the farm, that's the firearm that by far gets the most use. They're fun. I grew up when I was growing up. So I had a Winchester Model 54, I think it was, which was a little bolt action, single shot bolt action gun. It was a cheap gun. It was, I think, probably Winchester's cheapest 22 rifle. And it came normally with a birch stock, I think, but for a few dollars extra, you could get a walnut stock with grooves on the forearm. And so I had one of those, and I love that gun. And I took it apart. I took the stock off and I sanded. The stock was all dinged up and everything, the finish was gone. And I sanded it down, and I had my mom get some boiled linseed oil. And every night I would sit there and rub coats of linseed oil into that walnut. And I don't know. I'll bet I ended up with 200 coats into that thing, and it had this sort of shine to it that was. It looked like a pool that you could jump into. It was just beautiful. This kind of satin sheen, and I've always felt that way about 22 rifles. The more accurate they are, the more I like them, and the more interesting they are. But any bolt action 22 rifle, that's going to be my favorite. If I had to pick a gun out of the safe, to save in the event of a tsunami or something, I would grab my most used 22 rifle, bolt action rifle. I love them. I can't get enough of them. I've been before I learned to control my spending impulses, I used to go to the gun shows, and I would go down the racks of guns, and I would look for these, the old bolt action 22s. I love Mossbergs, by the way. I love Mossberg 22s. And I would just buy them. Because that was, at the time when you could get a really nice 22 bolt action rifle for $50, $60.
The good old days, right?
Yeah, the old days. And so I acquired a lot of them. Most of them I've since sold or given away. I've only kept the few that I really like. But yeah, bolt action 22 rifle. I just can't get enough of them. If I have time to go out and shoot recreationally, that's a gun I'm going to grab.
Nice.
And love those things. I love to go hunting with them, small game hunting. I like target shooting. I like plinking. There's just if I could only own one gun, that'd be it.
Nice. Well, we had some other questions come in while you were discussing the 22 rifle. What do you see as the most positive development in the firearm world over the last year?
Last year?
Last year.
Last year. Last year. I'm trying to think is what has happened in the last year. I can think of a lot of not particularly good things that have happened. Boy. I think probably in last year, probably some of the small victories that happened at the state level in the legislatures. I think that's probably the best things that have happened. I think that, at least I hope, that people are starting to realize that the Second Amendment fight is won locally. It's won at the state level. At the federal level, things are going to change all the time. But at the state level, that's where the fights need to happen. And this last year, at least in my state, and I know in a couple of others, I saw a little more activity, a few victories here in Oregon. And I've got to throw a shout out to Richard Lidzbarski, who just did stellar work in the Oregon legislature and actually managed to head off a couple of things that would have been bad for us had it made it even out of committee. I can tell you, because I have a cousin who was a state senator who is now running for U.S. Congress. Yes, he's got an R after his name. I can't help that. But he's a good guy. And I can tell you that the Liberal Gun Club has mind share amongst the legislatures in this state, and I hope in others as well. So I think if I had to look at one thing in the last year that I think is the most positive development, it's been that. It's been this grassroots activism that the LGC has promoted, and I think they have done very well with. I think they've done things that perhaps wouldn't have been able to be done otherwise. In this state, the legislature is controlled by the Democratic Party, and they're not going to be apt to listen to some, who they're not going to be listened to, the typical people who lobby for the gun community. And so having the LGC representative who does not fit the normal normal mold of a gun owner, who can put these Democratic legislators that we have at ease, I think that's probably the most positive thing that's happened, at least from where I sit here in Oregon.
Gotcha. Speaking of positive things, gun culture is changing. This was the most recent question, but it seemed like a good segue. How are you seeing it change beyond what you just mentioned with the grassroots activism, and how can we help move it along in a good direction?
I'm seeing a big change in the kind of people who are asking questions about firearms. In my mailbox, I'm seeing a lot of people of color that I didn't see before. Again, a lot of people from the LGBTQ community that I didn't see before. I got friended by a very, very nice African American lady from back east who's in her 70s, and who's talking about buying her first firearm because she's concerned about her safety as the country is sort of turning to the right. And I'm seeing just a lot of that. My mailbox is full of inquiries from people that I didn't see, 4 or 5 years ago. And I suspect that were I to hang around in the gun stores, or at least in the sporting goods stores, I would probably see that happening, because I know I know I'm getting the inquiries. I know other people are as well. I'm seeing, and this is not necessarily about guns per se, but what I'm seeing is a recognition among these groups of people about their safety and security sort of in general. So I'm seeing a lot more interest in preparedness, and I count firearms ownership and self-defense as simply a part of preparedness. I don't consider them separately. And so I'm seeing a lot of people coming into that preparedness part of it and going to the firearms part of it, either as a consequence of being more prepared, or they're starting with the firearm and sort of jumping into general preparedness as a result. I'm seeing a lot of that. And I'm seeing people who are maybe a little older than normal. I'm also seeing a surprising number of very young people, people who are just now able to buy, to legally buy a firearm. I'm seeing a lot of those too. And I think this is phenomenal. I'm seeing, a lot more women getting involved, particularly in leadership positions, particularly in positions in the firearms industry, more than I ever have before. And this is, I think, the most positive change I've seen. It's about damn time, and I'm glad to see it. I'm glad to see this, this is going to sound funny because I'm a good old boy, but I'm glad to see the Good Old Boys Club finally being sort of cracked apart. And because these people are the future of the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment is for everyone. And I stole that, by the way, from my buddy, Tony Simon, who runs the diversity shoots in New Jersey. If you haven't met Tony, he's a great guy. And if you do run into him, tell him hi for me. Fun guy. And he's done a lot to promote diversity in the firearms world there in New Jersey. And he coined the term, the second is for everybody, for everyone. And I steal it and give credit whenever I can. But I think that's the best thing that's happened.
Tony, by the way, is very LGC friendly for those who don't know him personally. I love Tony. He is a great guy. I echo Grant on that.
So the next question I have here, I actually didn't know that you did watchmaking. The question is, did you go from watchmaker to gunsmith, or vice versa, or both at the same time?
Okay, there's a story here. So when I was my last years of grade school and into high school, my mom got a job in a jewelry store. And in fact, she ended up in the jewelry industry. When my dad retired, he became a jeweler, and they opened up their own jewelry store until they retired. But she was working in a jewelry store in the little town. This is back, in the 70s. Every little town had a jeweler. And so the jewelry store was always owned by a watchmaker who would, fix watches and sell jewelry and, that kind of thing, the hometown jeweler. And when I would get done with my chores on the farm, by this time, we had ranched my entire life, and Dad was kind of winding down the ranching part of it. We had leased out part of our property to somebody who was going to farm it. And so I didn't have as many chores to do around the farm as I did previously. And, we only had about 12 head of cattle by this time. They were easy to feed. I could get that done, didn't have a lot to do. And so I would get that done in the summers when I was off of school. I would get my chores done, and I would go down to the jewelry store and hang around. And I would clean the glass on the cases and all that kind of thing. And the watchmaker, and we had of course, the watchmaker who owned the shop, the fellow that he had studied watchmaking with, fresh out of World War II, came in and handled some of the stuff for him. And he said one day, said my mom was, I think, complaining that I was getting underfoot or something. I don't remember. And he says, well, I'll take him out over to the shop and, teach him something. Maybe he'll make himself useful. And so we went over to his place, and he acquainted me with the world of watchmaking. And great old guy, and a fellow by the name of Orrin Carter, who unfortunately died many years ago, but I'll never forget him. And so he taught me watchmaking and clockmaking. And so I became, at one point, the youngest licensed watch and clockmaker in the state of Oregon. I was, I was 14 when I passed my first test. And at the time, the state regulated watchmakers. So you had to get a license if you wanted to operate it, kind of like beauticians have to get a license. That's gone away, I think, all over the country now. But at the time, you had to get a license. So I had to get a license as an apprentice. And then I had to pass a practical skills test to get a license to practice. So here I am at 14 years old, the youngest watchmaker in the state. And so when I was in college, I paid for college. This was before the days when you took out loans for college. Who does that? I worked to put myself through college. And one of the things I did was repair watches and clocks on the side. And after graduating from college, I gradually sort of weaned myself away from that. Still kind of kept my hand in it for a few years before finally giving it up. When I bought one of my first revolvers, and I wanted to do a trigger job on it. It happened to be a Colt Python, and I asked around, who can work on a Colt Python? And everybody said, "Oh my God, we can't work on a Colt Python. They are too complicated." And I thought, dude, you do not know what complicated is. I take apart, 3-train clocks. I take apart, watches with what are known as complications in them, refurbish them, put them back together. I do this stuff in my sleep. Trust me, this is not too complex to do. And so I took my knowledge of watchmaking and metal finishing and machining and all that sort of thing. By the way, one of the tests you had to pass to get a watch or clockmaker's license was a machining test. And so I did my own trigger job on the Colt. And I happened to show it to Masad Ayub, who I knew. And he said, "Hey, this is pretty good. Can I write an article about you?" I said, "Well, sure, I guess." And he wrote an article about me. And the next thing I know, I had people sending me guns from all over the United States, begging me to work on them. So that's how I became a gunsmith. I didn't intend to. It wasn't something that I went out and, consciously sought. It just sort of happened because, my background as a watchmaker. And then the first SHOT Show I went to, I went up to Bill Wilson, who of course owns Wilson Combat, and introduced myself. I said, "Hey, you and I have something in common." And he said, "What?" And I said, "We were both watchmakers." So we had a discussion sitting there at SHOT Show about watchmaking. We didn't talk about guns. We talked about watchmaking. So that's how that all happened.
Oh, excellent. I enjoyed that story. And it's funny you mentioned Wilson because that was mentioned earlier in the chat. So having you bring that up, I think scratched an itch for a few people here that were listening to that story. Now, how did you get started as an instructor then?
Oh, that started actually before the gunsmithing. I had been doing a lot of training because I wanted to become proficient. Using the firearm as a defensive tool. Again, I grew up using it as just a farm implement. And so the idea of using it as a defensive tool is completely new to me. And so I wanted to learn how to do it. I wanted to learn how to do it properly. And so I started doing a lot of studying, took a lot of classes, and people that I knew asked me to pass on what I had learned because they too wanted to, learn how to use their firearm defensively. And this was at the time when, this is at a time when concealed carry was getting very, very big. Oregon was one of the first states to adopt shall issue concealed carry. And so there were a lot of people in the early mid 90s who wanted training because they wanted to learn how to do this thing to carry their gun. And so I just sort of, started teaching people. And I had a background in teaching anyway. I taught several different things over the years. And so it was an easy transition into teaching people. And that's how I got started. And then the gunsmithing came after that. And I kind of put the teaching aside to do gunsmithing for a while because I didn't have enough time to do them both. So that's the teaching actually came first.
Okay. Who are your favorite shooters, or what are your influences when it comes to firearms in general?
That's an interesting question. Shooters. I'm a big fan of Jerry Miculek, of course, and who isn't? Jerry's a great guy, and I actually years and years and years ago, I had T-shirts made up when I went through the beginning of my revolver phase. I had T-shirts made up with a 1911 on it, hand holding a 1911 with a stovepipe in it, and the T-shirt said the West wasn't won with a jammed up gun. And on the back, it said Revolver Liberation Alliance. I just made that up. And so I sent one to Jerry, who at the time was working for Clark Custom Guns, which is his wife's family's business. And I'm told he wore it around the shop and actually wore it out. And years later, when I met him, I mentioned that, I heard you wore your shirt out. Do you want another one? He says, "You're the one who sent me that?" And we got kind of a laugh out of that. And so Jerry's a perennial favorite of mine. I'm a big fan of Rob Latham. Rob's a great guy. And he's just a bundle of energy. I like him a lot. I was a big fan of Brian Enos early on. And let's see, Julie Golub, of course, I think she's done a lot of good for the industry. Kay Clark Miculek, Jerry's wife, is an incredibly accomplished shooter in her own right. Everybody forgets about her because she's married to Jerry, but she was a champion shooter in her own right. People like that. And Masad Ayub is an old friend. Sheriff Jim Wilson is an old friend. So these are people that I admire and people that I like.
You listed some pretty big names in the industry there. Someone made a comment that you just know everybody.
Oh no, there are people that know far more people than I do. There are a lot of people I haven't met, and a lot of the younger folks I haven't met yet, and that saddens me a little bit, but they are developing their own sort of world out there, but there are a lot of really neat young people that are doing things. And in fact, last year at the Morro Bay thing that for the LGC last year, and meeting. Oh gosh, and I'm spacing on her name now. Lara, help me out.
Amy?
Amy, yes, thank you. Meeting her, and young gal. She doesn't think she's young, but she's younger than I am, and that's what counts. Very dynamic young gal, great shooter, great ambassador, and so these are the next people who are coming up, and it's a real privilege to get to know them.
We should get wrapping up here, as I was just poked. So I'm going to end with one of the questions. One last question, even though I just asked for several. Apologies to those that don't get their question asked. What is the one thing that people who just became gun owners should know?
That's an interesting question. There's so much. There's so many ways I could take that. If I had to pick one thing, I would say know the law. Know the law, because everything that we do in the firearms world is governed by the law and the things that we have to do. If you're using the firearm for a defensive tool, you have to know the law. If you're going out to buy a gun, you're going to interact with the law, so you should understand, what you are and are not allowed to do. I think that's probably the most important thing. We take the safety aspect for granted. Of course, they need to know that, but I think beyond that, they really need to know what the law is, particularly if they're going to use it in self-defense, because there are a lot of half-truths out there about the legal consequences of using a gun in self-defense. There's a lot of stuff the stuff promoted by people who are big names who should know the hell better, that still gets promoted. And so I would say studying the law is the most important thing.
Gotcha. I believe I'm going to hand it off to Ed if he's still here somewhere, so he can close it up for the rest of the evening.
I am. Grant, thank you so much. I have. It has been such a pleasure to get to know you over the last good Lord, it's 4 or 5 years now, maybe a little longer.
I've got to emphasize, it is an absolute honor to be able to share a space with everybody in the LGC. I told Richard and Mike this on the train ride home from last year. I cannot remember leaving a firearms industry function and being happy and excited. It's usually sort of a drain, but being around the LGC people, there's just so much energy, so much happiness. It's unlike anything else in the shooting world, and I feel very, very privileged that you allow me to share space with you. So thank you from the bottom of my heart.
We are privileged to share it with you as well. So, with the Mutual Admiration Society over, I'm gonna go ahead and call the ball here. And thank you so much. I know that this was somewhat last minute, and I do appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. I have told everybody that the name of the book is "I Want to Buy a Gun." And I believe the tagline is "A Non Judgmental Guide to Firearms Purchasing," or something along those lines.
Yeah.
And everybody should scroll up in the chat and download it, since everybody here ought to be a member, because it is free on the website, on the membership portal. So go out, get the book. If you like that book, he's got a bunch more. And we'll drop a link to his Amazon page as well, so you can get the rest of them.
Thank you.
I'm going to go ahead and kill the stream. So behave yourself for about 2 more seconds, and then we'll wrap up and say goodnight.